Good evening and welcome to the University of Manitoba Faculty of Education Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series. We are delighted that you could join us for the fourth and final presentation of this special lecture series focusing on truth and reconciliation. My name is Beryl Peters. I'm the Director of Practicum and Partnerships in the Faculty of Education, and I'm very privileged this evening to sincerely welcome each of you wherever you might be in the world at this moment. At the University of Manitoba, we are on traditional territories, so we'll begin by reflecting together on the University of Manitoba Traditional Territories Acknowledgement. Despite the challenges of this pandemic year, the Faculty of Education has continued to keep our commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and that begins with reaffirming that the very land we look out on during endless Zoom calls and that we step out on each day as spring renews our world is a traditional territory. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. In that spirit, and because this evening's presentation focuses on Indigenous spirituality, I'm honored to now welcome Elder Norman Mead and to invite him to open the sacred space and time together with prayer.
Miigwech, thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm honored. I guess you can all hear me? Yes, I get a nod. Yeah, good. When we come together like this and we come together with a prayer and to acknowledge the land that we are on, we need to acknowledge the spirits that come with us tonight. And it's in that light that I want to say this prayer from my heart to each and every heart that is hearing my prayer, so that we can unite our spirits as we listen to Dr. Stonechild's message to us tonight on Indigenous spirituality. For us as Indigenous people, as an Indigenous elder, spirituality lies in the listening of our stories of our ancestors. It lies in the things that we know about our Creator, about God, if you will. It's about sitting around sacred fires. It's about hearing the sound of the drum or the sound of the fiddle, as we know in the Métis homeland. Being connected to the land and to all the life that's on that land, the water, the forest, the wind, and the plants and the animals. It's all about that, about the connecting of that spirit of all of those living beings that are out there. It's knowing that when we live within the spirit, that it's the ancestors that watch over us and pass on the spirit to let us know that you're hearing our prayer tonight. Our spirit comes from the practice of our cultural teachings. Long before we had visitors from a different nation coming to us, we had those cultural teachings that we will hear about from Dr. Stonechild tonight. The sharing, the language, the ways of yesteryears or yesterday, the cultural practices, the respecting of our elders, the storytellers, we call them, the wisdom keepers, the knowledge keepers, knowing about the one who put us in this garden, as sometimes we hear in the Christian circles, knowing about that one who put us in the garden, the Creator, God Himself, the Creator. This is what we will hear about tonight. So when we come together in a good way tonight, and I accept that this tobacco that comes from Mother Earth and back to Mother Earth, it will go with a prayer, either onto the earth or in a sacred fire. And I will be praying that we will all learn something from the words that we will hear from Dr. Stonechild this evening. And I welcome him to our land, to this place, to this place we call Winnipeg on Turtle Island, to this place we call Manitoba Bay, where the Spirit rests, the very University of Manitoba where the Spirit rests, the University of Manitoba Bay. That's what we will hear about. And so I say, miigwech, Creator, for hearing us. Let us have open ears and open hearts as we listen to a lecture tonight, to the words of wisdom to bring us together in a good spiritual way. This is what I'm asking for, Creator. And I accepted the tobacco in this way tonight. I say, miigwech, Creator, for hearing my prayer for all of us that are part of the listening here tonight. I ask that you bless each and every one of us with your Spirit tonight in a good way. Miigwech. How?
Thank you, Elder Mead, for preparing our ears, our hearts, and our minds to receive the words and thoughts of tonight's lecturer, Dr. Blair Stonechild, who's joining us tonight from his home in Regina. As a result of moving our lectures online, we've been able to extend our reach to connect experts in education with a larger audience than ever before and in more communities. We very much welcome your participation this evening by inviting you to submit questions for our speaker. Video and mics are muted in this webinar format, but there will be a time for a moderated question and answer session at the conclusion of the presentation. You can submit your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A icon on your screen. Please note that the Q&A icon is different to the chat function that you might use in video conferencing. Questions that you submit using the Q&A function will be directed to a moderator to ask at the end of the session. I now invite Associate Professor Dr. Merle Tantic to introduce our honored guest speaker, miigwech.
Dansi, Buju, Shekon, good evening. I'm very excited and humbled to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Blair Stonechild, an award-winning author, historian, and scholar who is currently working as a professor of Indigenous Studies at First Nations University of Canada in Regina. Dr. Stonechild was born in Saskatchewan, Fort Qu'Appelle, near Regina. He is a member of the Musqueam Saulteaux First Nation, but has also Métis roots, as his mom was a Métis woman. He speaks English, French, and a bit of Cree. He is a residential school survivor, spending 9 years in residential school. This experience has triggered his deep interest towards history, politics, and spirituality. Dr. Stonechild's undergraduate degree is from McGill University, where he majored in political science. This choice to go to McGill was purely a rational one, as his older brother lived in Montreal at that time, and Blair spoke French. After completing his bachelor's degree, Blair decided to go to California to take some graduate courses there. But soon he returned to Regina and completed his master's and PhD degrees at the University of Regina. In 1976, Dr. Stonechild became the first faculty member at First Nations University of Canada and has served as the department head of Indian Studies, dean of academics, and executive director of planning and development at First Nations University. He considers his most significant accomplishment of his career the establishment and completion of the Regina campus of First Nations University, designed by the architect Douglas Cardinal. But Blair was one of the initiators and lobbyists for this major project, serving as the executive director of planning of the building. But let's not forget about his writing accomplishments. Dr. Stonechild has been impressively productive, as he has written 6 books, 4 of them single-authored. This is an amazing accomplishment, considering that writing one book may easily take about 4 to 5 years from start to finish. I came to know Dr. Stonechild through his book titled New Buffalo, The Struggle for Aboriginal Post-Secondary Education. This book still remains as one of the very few books written on Indigenous post-secondary education from the policy perspective. Since then, he has become passionate about Indigenous spirituality, publishing 2 books on the topic, and third is in the works. His most recent publication, a book titled Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality, came out last year in 2020. He will be sharing more about this project with us today. I have to say, Dr. Stonechild is such a kind and lovely person and very humble over his significant accomplishments. He describes himself as not a natural-born writer, giving some hope for the rest of us here. He claims not to be a methodical writer who has a rigid daily writing routine. When he's writing a book, he sees himself as a sculptor, working on a piece of art, chipping a bit on one part of the piece, chipping a bit on the other, then looking at it from a distance and getting back to work again. I asked Dr. Stonechild for his CV, and when I received it, I was a bit surprised. People typically start their CVs with listing their most prominent accomplishments, stating their awards and recognitions received or degrees granted, but not Dr. Stonechild. His first paragraph of his CV is about what he is most proud of, his family. He states that he's married to Sylvia and that they have 3 children. This speaks volumes about what kind of man Dr. Stonechild is and what values he holds dear to his heart. In addition to spending time with family, he likes to take long walks, enjoys running, and has casually run a full marathon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Blair Stonechild.
Tansei, Anine, Bonjour. Hello, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here with you this evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Elder Norman for his prayer. It's very important in our tradition that this be done before anything like this starts, in order that we all know that this is a sacred conversation. Also like to thank Dr. Falkenberg for inviting me to give this presentation. And finally to Marilee for that very generous and kind introduction. I will just call up my presentation. Second here. I hope everyone can see this.
Not yet, Dr. Stonechild.
Can you see it?
Not
Okay,
right now.
Okay, just a second.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
If you want to start your PowerPoint
Right,
and
it
then
is.
share your screen.
It is okay. Just a second. It's up here. And try share screen. Here we go. It's showing now.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So if you want to begin the slideshow. Just up at the top there, view slideshow.
Right. Okay. And start from the beginning. Just a second. Okay. There we go.
Perfect.
I'm still getting used to all this new technology, so if you'll just bear with me. So Marilee did a very thorough introduction of my background. And I would just simply mention that I was hired again at the First Nations University of Canada in 1976, which makes that about 45 years now. And of my experience, I have to say that my most valued experience in working all those years at the First Nations University was the opportunity to meet so many wonderful elders. And they were the ones who basically led me down the path that I've pursued to this day, and really have been the ones that have educated me all about Indigenous culture and spirituality. Now, I will mention a few elders, specifically Danny Musqua, Mike Pinay, and Noel Starblanket, because they're the ones who helped me the most and encouraged me in writing the books, the two books that I published on Indigenous spirituality. And I certainly owe them a great deal of gratitude for that, for their help. So my motivation for my work in this specific presentation on Indigenous spirituality has really come from my experience at residential school, where, as Marilee mentioned, I spent 9 years. And in particular, it was the experience of what's called spiritual abuse. And this is a phenomenon identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I do recall are the endless prayers, confessions, rosaries, and masses that I experienced during the time of my schooling. As many of you may know, residential school was predicated on the idea that as Indigenous children, we needed to have moral development, and that generally took the place in form of both discipline as well as religious instruction. So here's an image which many of you have probably seen. This young gentleman was featured in many government publications. You might call him the poster boy of residential schools. His name was Thomas Moore. We always used to wonder where exactly Thomas came from. And I was quite surprised to discover, after looking at the registers of the Regina Indian Industrial School, that he was actually from my community of Muscopetone. And we found out that his real name was Kishik. Now, there's some interesting thing about this picture. If you take a look at the picture on the left, what do you see him holding in his hand? Well, he's actually holding a pistol, which of course is not exactly, part of the traditional ceremonial garb, is it? But the picture was meant to impart a message. And that message was that Indigenous people were uncivilized, unpredictable, and potentially violent. So we have his transformation now on the right, around the age of 12. And he looks like a fine young gentleman. But this picture doesn't tell the whole story. The full story is that he died shortly after this picture was taken from tuberculosis. Now, this image is something which is called Lacombe's ladder. It's an example of spiritual abuse in the classroom. Because I recall this picture as I used to come in and out of the classrooms at the residential school. It was hanging on the wall right beside the door. It's actually longer than this. This is only the top part. But what it does show is two paths. One path is on the left are those of Indigenous people who have converted and are on the way to heaven and eternal happiness. And you can see Christ seated in the middle. Off to the left is a temporary stopping place of purgatory. But on the right, there were actually images of traditionally dressed Indigenous people who, because they did not have the knowledge of Christianity, were on the other path, which led to, in this image, a very certain destination, which is, of course, that of eternal damnation in hell. And where, where the devils were and Satan. And so, of course, this was extremely, something that really bothered a lot of us a lot, when we saw this picture and, we, thought about all of the messages that we were constantly being bombarded with. And so just to give an example of our routine, when we woke up in the morning, first thing we did when we got out of bed was to say a prayer. After getting cleaned up, we'd go downstairs and go to the dining hall for breakfast. First thing we do is we would say another prayer. We'd eat our meal and conclude the meal with another prayer, which we call a grace. Then we go back to our playroom for a while and get ready for class. We go up to the classroom. First thing we would do, say another prayer. After classes were over and it was time for lunch, we would go down to the dining hall again, say another grace before the meal and another grace after the meal. And so it continued. After classes, we every day would say an entire rosary. On weekends, we all had to attend Sunday Mass, and part of the process of attending Sunday Mass was going to confession. And many of us, including myself, acted as Mass servers. So, we did additional religious training there. And so, as I mentioned, this left a real lasting impact on me, and it raised many questions in my mind about what we were hearing. We were in sermons. We heard a lot about the Bible, about the stories of Abraham and Adam and Eve, and many other things. But for some reason, I was always a bit confused about what all it meant. And, the implication, of course, was that there was something wrong with us, that somehow we, were, really burdened with sin. And I know that when I thought of my relatives and I thought about my kukum and my mushum, I didn't see them at all as bad people. I saw them as very kind and gentle people. And so, to me, something was just not adding up, and that's something which I really spent much of my life wondering about. And so, when I got to university, this is something which I continued to think about. And as I began to learn more and more, listening to the elders, the real picture of what Indigenous spirituality really meant began to become clear in my mind. So that eventually led to this book, which came out in 2016, The Knowledge Seeker, Embracing Indigenous Spirituality. And this is actually the book that Dean Falkenberg actually asked me to talk about. So I'll begin with this image of, people would call it a medicine circle. And this is an image which many people are probably familiar with. What it shows are what are called the 4 quadrants of being. We have, of course, a physical aspect, our body and the physical world around us. There's the emotional aspect, various feelings and attitudes. Then we have a mental or intellectual aspect, our thinking, intellectual abilities, our abilities to gain insights and to make sense of the world in a certain way. And of course, as humans, to very much be able to manipulate the world. And then, of course, finally, there is the spiritual aspect. Now, in the teachings that I received, the last one, the spiritual aspect, is actually the most important of the four of these. The reason being that this is where we originated from. In a sense, it's our true home. And it's also the place to which we return. And so I will elaborate more on this as we go throughout the presentation. So when people would ask, what is Indigenous spirituality? It was often not a simple thing to explain. And I myself had to struggle with what is the best way to explain it. And so as I did my research for the Knowledge Seeker book, I interviewed many elders. And they're the ones who helped me to formulate what I believe are the two essential things that you need to know if you want to understand the basics of Indigenous spirituality. The first one is what I call, it's a great principle, which is called Rekindling. In education, we often like to talk about ontology, or in other words, like where does everything start from? What, how did this whole human story begin? And so the way it was explained to me is that, first of all, we have to understand that spirit is something that is real. Not only that, but we as humans are not just physical bodies, but we are actually spirit beings. And the elders explained to me that as spirit beings, we desire to experience physical life. And so Creator Manitou granted us that permission. And so we enter physical life, and in experiencing physical life, we experience separation in time and space, just as all of us here are apparently separate entities, and we're all experiencing time. And what happens to our spiritual memory, our spiritual life, is shrouded in a veil, and that leaves one's consciousness to challenge itself, basically to experience physical life, but in experiencing physical life, also to remember where he came from and to find a way, ultimately, to return to the spirit world and to the Creator. Now, why on earth would we want to come and experience physical life? Well, I'm told that our main purpose here is to learn. And specifically, it's to learn about healthy relationships, not only between humans, but with everyone. And so this brings me to the second part, something which is called Neo-Chetawin, which is basically, you can call it epistemology, which is, sort of an explanation of how it is we should be behaving or what we should be doing in experiencing physical life. And it can be boiled down to what's called the law of harmonious relationship. You may have heard of it explained in other terms. For example, in the Iroquois Haudenosaunee tradition, it's called the Great Law of Peace. And it's based upon the principles that good relationships are to be promoted as part of our spiritual learning, and that these relationships are not only to be between humans, but also with all created things, animate and inanimate. And so, as part of our spiritual quest, we have a number of spiritual tools. We're gifted with a number of spiritual tools. The first one I'll talk about is what is often referred to as the 7 virtues. Some people call it the 7 values. Other people have called it the 7 great laws, because these virtues were indeed laws. They were not necessarily just things that were good, but they were actually things that people were expected in an virtually legalistic way to achieve. And these, of course, include humility, respect, love, honesty, bravery, generosity, and finally, wisdom. So, in other words, a person was expected to be humble. A person was expected to be respectful. A person was expected to be honest and generous, and so on and so forth. And if individuals did not live up to these standards, there were sanctions, which could range anywhere from mild ridicule to being banished, or even worse. The second set of tools that I would mention are what I call the 7 spiritual disciplines. And I will list them here: fasting, sharing, learning, teaching, parenting, praying, and meditating. So each of these spiritual disciplines are practices that, if done, will help us on our spiritual journey. The whole experience of fasting is a way in which we can discipline our physical body, for example. Sharing is a way of achieving generosity. Parenting is certainly a way of achieving humility, generosity, and wisdom. And then we get to the more meditative parts, which are praying, for example. In Indigenous tradition, there are a lot of prayers said, and also meditation, which is a practice which often people don't realize was part of our spiritual disciplines. And then finally, we have the ceremonies. And we have a number of ceremonies. There are some significant ones which I've listed here. There's the pipe ceremony, which is a calling on the Creator to witness certain events. Perhaps it's a meeting, a greeting, or a discussion of some sort. And so the pipe connects us with that spiritual side of us. There's the sweat lodge, which many of you may have heard about, and that is essentially a cleansing ceremony where you symbolically experience rebirth in the bowels of Mother Earth, so to speak. There's the vision quest, which was primarily followed by males who were at the point of puberty. And the vision quest is where you basically take a step to a purposeful step to go into isolation for several days, fasting and praying, and asking for a vision which will give you some indication of your relationship and your mission from a spiritual point of view. And this was often the first real connection that individuals had with first real connection with the spirit world. And then there's what's called the sun dance. It's sometimes so-called the thirst dance. And it is a ceremony which is done collectively by the community. And it is done at the spring solstice. And it's a prayer for renewal and for the fulfilling of vows. And then we have something called the Spirit Lodge, which is the more specialized ceremony, often used to elicit information from the spirit world. And there are many other ceremonies, many of them connected to animal spirit helpers. So ceremonies are very important to us because they constantly remind us of our spiritual nature, our spiritual role, and our responsibilities as spirit humans who are experiencing a physical journey. And ceremonies are a very important way of seeking healing, and through the power which these ceremonies imparted. And so that's sort of a very quick thumbnail sketch of the principle, what I would call the principles and the basic tools of Indigenous spirituality. And of course, the elders are here, and there are many elders who can better explain than I can, including Elder Norman, about specific practices and to help individuals experience specific ceremonies. My approach as a knowledge keeper and what the elders encouraged me to do was to use my academic training to help to interpret what the meaning of Indigenous spirituality is in the modern context. And so what I have done is I have done research, and I've attempted to do this research from the point of view of reinterpreting it from an Indigenous point of view. So the first point I'll make tonight is that at universities, we tend to begin the conversation about history by starting with the rise of civilization, which, was about 6,000 years ago. Some people say it's maybe 10 or 12,000 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that archaeologists and scientists all agree that modern humans have been on Earth for at least 200,000 years. And so this, of course, raises the question, well, what about that whole period prior to 6,000 years ago, right? There's approximately 194,000 years of, apparently missing history. And of course, we tend to say, well, we don't know anything about it. We dismiss it, saying that there's nothing really worth looking at, that people were primitive, they were cavemen. They were not intellectual because they didn't have writing. They were not advanced because, they did not have agriculture or were exploiting the environment. But does it not make sense? And many anthropologists have noted this, that obviously the people who existed then must have had some way of understanding their environment and relating to it. And so what I am here to tell you today is that this whole period prior to civilization was in fact a period when Indigenous people were exclusively living on the earth. And they were practicing a spirituality in which they had an intensely respectful and intimate relationship with the natural world. And I term this Indigenous Eden, and I talk about that obviously in my second book. And Indigenous Eden would be a place in which there were harmonious relationships, not only with people, but also with the environment. There was an extreme gratification, marveling at creation and gratitude to the Creator for allowing humans to experience the gifts of creation. And in return, there was respect for all of the created entities, and there was minimal interference with them, and negligible degradation of the environment, and as well, minimal social inequality. Now, let me just simply say that, when we talk about the Garden of Eden, we think of someplace that's so perfect that there's never any problem. And of course, the Christian concept of the Garden of Eden is often something that is portrayed as something that maybe was not a real physical place, but in the way I see it, humans came upon a Garden of Eden, and they lived in it. And as long as they followed the original instructions, so to speak, of the Creator, it was a very pleasant and nurturing place. And I'm not saying that it was perfect, because I believe that as humans, we would make mistakes. However, the difference is that through our spiritual understandings and training in our ceremonies, we always found ways to find healing so that we could preserve Indigenous Eden. And so what I ended up concluding was something that was to me quite startling because, like I'm sure almost every one of you, civilization is portrayed as probably the best thing that has ever happened to humans and is really the only thing that has ever been noteworthy about human achievements. But when I started looking at it from an Indigenous perspective, I started to get a whole new view of it. Now, so first of all, let me just say a few things. If, civilization generally, you could say originated approximately 6,000 years ago. And if you do the math, that's only the last 3% of humanity's existence, modern humanity's existence. And so what is civilization itself? Well, I actually went to the library and dug up about a dozen books on the topic of civilization. And I came to find that there's a very clear and simple definition of civilization. And the most definitive one was one that was made by what was called the International Commission for a History of the Scientific and Cultural Development of Mankind. It was a United Nations associated international effort of thousands of scholars from across the world who studied civilization. And they basically came up with the essential definition of civilization. And so definition, and they just was a quote taken from this commission. It says, it basically occurred when men were inspired to counterattack against nature and make the momentous revolution in human history. So what are they saying? Well, essentially, they're saying that civilization arose when humanity decided essentially to rise up and dominate nature. Now, we also see reflections of this in, of course, something which many of us are familiar with, which is the Bible, Genesis. In Genesis 1:26, it says, God said, let us make humankind in our own image. Let him have domination over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over all the cattle and over all of the wild animals of the earth. And so this, as I concluded, was essentially a rejection of a longstanding Indigenous ideology and spirituality and ideology. Now, the most recent iteration of this is, of course, is what we call the Age of Reason. Some people call it the Enlightenment, rationality. So rationalism as an ideology is a specific rejection of spirituality. So to quote Immanuel Kant, he says, morality in no way needs religion, but is rather self-fulfilling by virtue of pure practical reason. In other words, what it's saying is all we need is our mind in order to solve any and all problems. Anything having to do with spiritualism or belief in spirit is supernaturalism and superstition and is to be discarded. So this ideology of rationalism began around the late 1600s, early 1700s, and it reached its fullest expression around the 1820s. And I call the 1820s a pivotal decade for a number of reasons. One of which is that in the 1820s was the time when non-Indigenous people began to outnumber Indigenous people in the world. It was also a time of explosion of science and technology, which drove explosion in world population, commerce, colonization, of course, and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And the world population explodes beyond the Earth's natural carrying capacity, which is approximately 1.5 billion. And so all of this has basically happened. All of these forces which have shaped our contemporary world have really only been in full force for the last 200 years. So I'll start the conclusion of my talk and just simply say, well, why does all this matter? Well, one of the things I argue is that spirituality is actually a higher form of intelligence. Because a lot of people say Indigenous people were not intelligent. We didn't use our brains, and it's proven in the way that we were living. We weren't developing technology, we weren't exploiting resources. But what I tell people is that Indigenous people were just as capable of having an intellectual thought as any other people in the world. And in fact, we did use our intellect to, for example, develop many edible forms of food. We had our own mathematical, astronomical, and architectural achievements. But the difference was that our intellect was not harnessed to civilization and the imperatives of civilization, which is the quest for money, wealth, and power. Our intelligence was basically subservient to our spirituality, so that we would not really do anything of any import until we had gone through our ceremonies, prayed for guidance from our elders, from our ancestors, before we decided to do anything. And that's why Indigenous societies were so cautious in their approach to exploiting the environment, because they really believed that creation was to be respected in its own right, and that we did not have a God-given right to dominate and exploit the rest of creation. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the average time span of a mammalian species is said to be 1 million years. So if you take a look at our human experience, we've been around for about 200,000 years, or 20% of the life expectancy of similar species. And so, in some ways, if you want to kind of compare that to a human life, we're like a 20-year-old. And then I just insert the sentence which says that civilization by nature are self-destructive because they pursue wealth and power, and in doing so tend to create negative relationships with other other human groups, and also destroy nature through exploitation. And so I think the kind of lesson which I'm trying to impart today is one about taking another look at our human experience, taking another look at how we've treated Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, the Indigenous past, how we've simply dismissed Indigenous people as irrelevant, as useless, and how we've obviously dispossessed, how Indigenous people have dispossessed in terms of their lands and their power, and that whole situation continues today. And we're still seeing the results of residential schools, and we're still seeing the effort at trying to reconcile this past. And so, for those who are concerned about human survival and are looking for a new paradigm, which you hear more and more of today, we need to do things a different way. What I basically say is, the Indigenous model or the Indigenous paradigm was the original one. There wasn't anything wrong with it. As a matter of fact, it was highly successful and is essentially the most obvious and viable option. What the elders would say basically is that we as humans need to return to the good path of Indigenous spirituality. So I'll leave you with a few resources. I know teachers are always looking for resources. There's a few here that I really like. The first one is by Vine Deloria. He was probably the most prolific scholar. He's deceased now, but he wrote about 20 books. And the very last book he wrote and concluded just before he passed away, was the book called The World We Used to Live In. And it talked about our spirituality and the powers, the gifts which our spiritual life gave us in terms of being able to live successfully in the world. The second book is actually by an author who would be local to you, Chantal Fiola, who works at the University of Winnipeg, wrote a book called Rekindling the Sacred Fire, which I thought was excellent. And it's an explanation of the basics of Indigenous spirituality. It is a story of the Métis who, prior to the mid-1800s, had very much adopted Indigenous spirituality, but when the missionaries came, reverted to Catholicism, and now in recent years are rediscovering the wonders of Indigenous spirituality and ceremonies. Third book, by Melissa Nelson, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future. And actually, I've got that title a bit wrong. The actual full title is called Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future. And it's a compilation of statements by a number of Indigenous elders as to how what they call the original instructions or original spiritual teachings can help us to, heal and preserve the environment. And then finally, I list my two books. I'm one of the few authors who have written about Indigenous spirituality in a systematic way. The Knowledge Seeker, Embracing Indigenous Spirituality, basically looks at the viability of Indigenous spirituality as a belief system, and obviously argues that it is extremely viable. The second book was written in response to reaction to the first book. The second book, Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality, basically talks about what happened to Indigenous spirituality and why is it that it is not something that is, that is, for example, regarded as one of the world's great religions anymore. So I will just leave you with an image of my last book, and I will thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, I would be more than happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Blair Stonechild, for sharing your knowledge and your teaching with us today. We have plenty of time to ask a few questions here, and I see in the Q&A box that the questions are coming in. So Beryl and I will try to moderate or facilitate the Q&A session as best as we can. So the first question goes, who taught you to think critically?
Creatively?
Who taught you to think critically? How were you triggered to start seeking the truth?
Okay. Yes, I think I was probably always someone who reflected and thought about things even when I was a youth, because I used to sit in residential school and I used to wonder about why it was that we were confined behind the walls of a residential school, walls and fences, while the world went on around us. Now, as I had mentioned to Merle, I'm not necessarily a writer by, a natural writer. And I would say that it really was, like the university system that taught me how to think critically. And for example, my first two books, the Loyal Till Death book, which is about the 1885 uprising, was the product. It was co-written with historian Bill Wazer, and it was based on my master's thesis, which was a look at the events of 1885, and it featured the oral history, which I had heard from Indigenous elders, which basically told a diametrically opposite story of what happened in 1885. And so the other thing, I guess, really was the teachings of the elders, because, when I came out of university, I would have to say that in many ways I was brainwashed, especially in terms of spirituality. I didn't really, when I started working at the First Nations University, I didn't really understand the elders. I thought, they had a lot of interesting stories and things to tell, but as a system of thought, as an ideology, I can't really say that I really understood, and it took me a long time to kind of get it in my head, and and they sort of had to explain it to me, in increasingly simple terms until I actually sort of got it. But so the way I see our thinking, and I know in the book in the book Loss of Indigenous Eden, I criticize universities as being universities of civilization. And, we teach all of these, many of these disciplines which assist humans in continuing to dominate and exploit nature. And, we're kind of stuck. I call it being, we're kind of stuck in this box of civilizational thinking. It's become a mental box for us. We're stuck in this way of seeing things. And so, I tell people, we're missing a whole tradition of thought, which is that of Indigenous thought, which of course was dismissed as illogical, as superstitious. But, that thought existed for many millennia prior to, what we think of as rationalism or the age of reason. Rationalism is only 2 or 3 centuries old. Compare that to 200,000 years of Indigenous thought, and there still are Indigenous people today who retain that thought system, and we're kind of living proof of that, of the persistence of that ideology. And I guess the other thing, of course, is once you think of all of the damage that 200 or 300 years of the age of reason has done to us, my God, how much longer can we afford to go on?
Thank you very much, Dr. Stonechild. The second question goes like this. In Euro-American philosophy, epistemology means theory of knowledge. You explain epistemology in terms of relationships and harmony. Can you say more about how relationships and ways of knowing are connected?
Right. So I guess when I say epistemology, the idea is that this gives us knowledge as to how we're to behave as humans. Right? That's what I'm talking about when I talk about theory of knowledge. Now, you see, the other interesting thing is that in our language, the term knowledge is kind of funny because it doesn't really have the same stark division between what we call secular knowledge and spiritual knowledge. In our tradition, the important knowledge was really the spiritual knowledge. And so that, if you're going to say theory of knowledge, well then, I would insert the point that our essential knowledge, our most important knowledge, was spiritual knowledge. It was knowledge about who we are as spiritual beings, what our mission as humans are, and as spiritual beings, how we should behave. And so, I'm maybe taking a bit simplistic approach about it, but, in terms of the secular tradition, there are so many different fields of knowledge. It's almost mind-boggling. But to us, there was one body of important knowledge, which was spiritual knowledge, and all the other stuff basically fell underneath that. And, a lot of the knowledge systems that we have right now are basically products of civilization. A lot of our technology came out of our desire to wage war or to exploit the resources. So, I mean, a lot of these knowledge systems are not what we as Indigenous people would consider to be necessarily spiritual or wise knowledge systems. And, I take the example of chemistry, for example. People say, I was asked one time, well, what can Indigenous people contribute to chemistry? You can go to university and take classes and get a degree, and you can get a job in a pharmaceutical company or whatever, make lots of money. But, what I tell people is if it was Indigenous chemistry, we would never be producing chemicals which are dangerous, that kill people, that destroy the environment, or chemicals that are simply produced for the sake of making money. You see, that's the difference between Indigenous chemistry and mainstream chemistry, and that's where I say that, the Indigenous wisdom is the higher form of intelligence, so to speak.
Dr. Stonechild, I don't know if you have had a chance to take a look at the chat, but people are just saying, bravo, wonderful presentation, giving you high prize there. I hope that after the session today, you have a time to read through some of the comments here.
Well, they can reward me by buying my books.
Other people saying that they have received your book already.
Oh, good.
Sales are going up, I'm sure. So the next question has to do with the use of tobacco. Please explain why tobacco became the plant used for secret ceremonies over any other plant. Do you know what was used before tobacco became the sacred plant?
Well, tobacco is a North American plant, and has been used, for millennia, I would say. And this tradition of smoking is not necessarily a ceremony that exists in other parts of the world. Other parts of the world, they could use, maybe incense or some other type of similar thing. But what I would say in terms of our sacred plants, and there's a couple of them, these plants, like many other things that we learn to use in our spiritual traditions, were basically gained through our form of gaining knowledge, which was through ceremony, through seeking spiritual intelligence or information. And, some people have a hard time understanding how, for example, if you go into a ceremony, how you can get information or messages from, let's say, plants or animals, or that type of thing. But essentially, that's how our elders tell us, and I believe it because I've, experienced this phenomenon of being able to experience or to obtain information in a non-rational way. And so, this is how, for example, plants came to be used for various ceremonies. And so, I would simply say that, this was virtually a sacred communication between people in the tobacco plant, which became, sort of a medium or a messenger between humans and the spirit world.
Thank you. Beryl?
Thanks, Merle. Of course, this is when my computer took time to do a restart. So I'm not sure where our
Beryl, I have to stop you there. You have an echo in the background. We have a hard time hearing you. Let me ask you the next question. So the next question has to do with something Marie Petist has pointed out in her book. So Marie Petist says that after first contact, Indigenous peoples in the East Coast areas were attracted to the religious views brought by Jesuit priests. Given the seeming balance and completeness of Indigenous spirituality already existing, I'm wondering what might explain this attraction. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. The way I understand it from the elders is that as Indigenous people, we very much prized the spiritual belief systems of other groups. And it's almost to the point where spiritual information And for example, the earning the protocols and rights to offer ceremonies that came from other groups was almost like a highly treasured commodity, because we saw all of these gifts of understandings, of insights, spiritual insights, of ceremonies that various peoples had developed as all coming from the Creator. And so when Europeans came here, there's a book which actually talks about, it's called Moon of Wintertime, talks about contact between missionaries and Indigenous people. And I think he's got the basic idea that, Indigenous people perceived the message of Christianity as being another form of almost an indigenous belief. And that, this message of a more direct connection to the Creator was something that appealed to Indigenous people. So, that's all that Indigenous people ever understood from their perspective, is that, like anything spiritual that they heard came directly from the Creator. Now, of course, it's a very difficult topic because people don't like to criticize religion. But the elders have told me time and time again that there is a distinction between what we understand as spirituality and what religions are, particularly the Abrahamic religions. The way I would explain that, and I've done that in my book, Loss of Indigenous Eden, I basically call religions the handmaidens of civilization, because even though they try to get us to have an understanding of the Creator and rules to live by and that type of thing, they have become very closely married to our own self-concept as people. For example, when God says humans are made in the image of God, that becomes something which strays from the original definition of how we understand the Creator. And so, there's the old saying, the missionaries came, they gave us the Bible and we gave them the land, so to speak, right?
So the next question has to do with singing a song in a choir. A question: do you have any tips or tricks for introducing an Indigenous song to a choir and having the members understand the spirituality around it, as well as doing it appropriately?
So an Indigenous song to a choir. Well, it's interesting because, there are efforts to reconcile between, religions, churches, and Indigenous people, Indigenous sometimes with ceremonies and songs and language and that type of thing. And, these things I think are all okay as long as they're done respectfully. To me, the danger is when, religions attempt to basically co-opt Indigenous spirituality by, which is something that, for example, Catholicism has been very adept at. Throughout their whole history, they've been very adept at taking Indigenous ceremonies, even Christmas and Easter and all of these type of things, and then incorporating them into their own practices and liturgy and that type of thing, without recognizing or acknowledging what these Indigenous spiritualities and belief systems really meant, what they were really about. And so, but I guess there's always a place to start. And so, as I mentioned, I don't think there's anything wrong with it as long as it's done in the spirit of respect and the spirit of reconciliation and attempting to understand more. Especially, I think the church has real onus to understand what Indigenous spirituality is about, because too often it's just a one-way street.
That was very helpful. Next question: what is your definition of reconciliation? How do you see this process? What is reconciliation to you?
Well, people have, sometimes pointed out that, it's difficult to have. Sorry, I'm just. It's sometimes difficult to have reconciliation when there wasn't conciliation in the first place. I don't know if that makes sense. How can you reconcile when there wasn't conciliation or understanding in the first place? So some people have problems with that to begin with. But I think, there are perhaps varying degrees of reconciliation. There is, for example, you take something like indigenization at universities, which is an attempt to understand and accommodate Indigenous students and Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledge. And that, to me, is, again, one of these things where it's a start. Now, some people would say that there really won't be full reconciliation until there's kind of like equal status, equal understanding, equal weight given to both understandings, both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Somehow to be able to reconcile those two knowledge systems together. And that's actually going to be the subject of my next book, which I'm working on, because, the first book talked about the viability of Indigenous spirituality. The second one talked about loss of Indigenous, talked about the past. This last one will talk about the future and the role of Indigenous spirituality in terms of how it can solve or be instrumental in solving the future challenges. Basically, what I say is that, there needs to be more openness and respect for Indigenous knowledge. And for those who begin to understand that they become allies of Indigenous people, because Indigenous people are obviously too powerless to change things by themselves. And coming back to the point about, that Indigenous people were still the majority world population even 200 years ago. And in Europe as well, if it wasn't for Julius Caesar and his Roman Empire, like the Indigenous people of Europe would have been flourishing, because, Julius Caesar basically created his emperorship on the slaughter of Indigenous peoples of Europe, right? And of course, the Holy Roman Empire completed the process of Christianizing the rest of Europe, although there are still pockets of Indigenous people left in Europe. But what I would say is that surely there is still some genetic memory left in people, right? Because it's not that long ago that, they were actually Indigenous. So hopefully we can, we can all re-indigenize before, we're taken over by robotics and have implants put in our brain or whatever.
Next question. What does the two-eyed seeing model mean to you? Do you have any thoughts on that, the two-eyed seeing?
Oh, two-eyed seeing, yes.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. That's from Elder Marshall, who's a Mi'kmaq elder. I've met him and heard of his teachings. Basically, what he's doing is two-eyed seeing is being able to look at the world from both perspectives of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. That's the way I understand it, that these are two sort of ideologies, two ways of seeing the world. And they are quite different in some ways. At this point, I would say in many ways they are irreconcilable. But I think what I'll argue in my book is that there is a way to reconcile them, which would be to bring these two eyes back, like into one vision, right? So, the two-eyed seeing to me is sort of like a bifocal way of saying things, right? It's sort of like you're trying to look at it, from one perspective and then switching to the other one and trying to understand where everything sits. Whereas from my point of view, I think it is possible to reconcile both ideologies. However, that'll only happen once once people recognize that civilization was a mistake, and that we have gone off the good path, and that we need to renounce the civilizational approach, which is basically, like the putting forward of humanity itself, imposing ourselves on nature and making ourselves the center of creation, which, as I mentioned, is totally against our Indigenous teachings. And so being able to go back and recognize that that was a mistake, being able to get out of this box of civilizational thinking and being able to, I guess, unwind or reconstruct, as they say, like say in academia, some of these, many of these damaging knowledge systems and technologies. We have to pedal it back, right? And we have to heal the environment, have to heal ourselves. And it doesn't mean going back to, to primitive, so-called primitive ways and that type of thing. I mean, these Indigenous people, given thousands of years, would have eventually developed all of the technologies that we have today, except they would have been safe and spiritual. And what is possible, I think, hopefully before humanity destroys itself, is that, with the help of allies, that, we can bring the powers of education and powers of government to bear to, to reshape the world in more of an Indigenous perspective.
Question about post-secondary education. So universities and colleges are institutions, places of knowing, of knowledge. Spirituality is such a key in Indigenous ways of knowing. Do you think that there is a place for spirituality in our universities and colleges right now?
Well, right now, it's not something that's a serious part of university approaches to teaching. We basically live we're still under the age of what we would call the age of reason and rationalism, right? That's the prevailing view right now in virtually all of the, disciplines at the university. Now they have religious studies, but again, religious studies tend to focus on religions, which again, I mean, if you take, for example, analysis of Christianity, most of it is based on, trying to reconstruct a physical history of what happened, for example, with Christ or whatever, that type of thing, right? And, histories of, the founders of these religions. And so, we would say that from our perspective, the most important knowledge is not being taught, which is the spiritual knowledge, which is the wisdom. What's the point of teaching kids, reading and writing and arithmetic and computers and stuff if you don't teach them wisdom, right? Because what happens is that, I tend to describe the mind without spiritual guidance as being like a rabid dog, because it goes around doing all kinds of crazy and strange and dangerous things. And so, if we want to be truly, intelligent, spiritually mature and intelligent people, then the spiritual teachings need to be there. And I think that this idea of the original instructions is something that's very important, because it predated civilization, and I think it demonstrates how civilization has been a mistake.
There is something that you mentioned earlier. I want to come back to that. You said that the Indigenous peoples are still powerless.
That's correct. Yeah.
Do you believe that, or do you see that they're the younger generation that is reclaiming the power, and it's starting to shift in the society, the hierarchy of power in a way? Do you see that?
Yes, I can see that. Yeah. We're starting to regain our power, right? By being able to educate our kids in our own culture, and, being able to control our own communities and develop our own resources and businesses and that type of thing. Our own institution, like the First Nations University, for example, is now able to, research and write and publish, from its own perspective, from an Indigenous perspective. But, a lot of these we're regaining a bit of power, but, in terms of the type of power that's needed, for example, to change, let's say, the direction of a country or the direction of the world, the kind of power you need are the powers of a state, right? Like the power over education, the power over finance, the power over, legislation, that type of thing. And so, we're gaining more power over our own lives, but we certainly do not have anywhere near the power that's necessary to change the world.
I'm scanning through the questions here while we're getting at the end almost. There's a question from a PhD student. I'm beginning my second year of PhD studies. I'm studying holistic education. My proposal is based solely on Indigenous paradigm and have created a conceptual model based on it. Spirituality is an area that is difficult to promote in the classroom in communities that are highly Christianized. How could we begin to teach through a spiritual aspect? How can we start this process?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really glad to hear that, that the student is, using holistic education and is incorporating spirituality as part of that. So, the thing about Indigenous culture, if you take a look at the way in which Indigenous people approach the world, we didn't approach the world with the perspective of getting a job or making money or, getting some kind of, getting, all kinds of wealth and power and that type of thing. If you take a look at the priorities of Indigenous culture, what it was developing your spiritual life, right? That was the priority. Take a look. Some people, they used to accuse Indigenous people of constantly being in ceremonies and being lazy and stuff. But we weren't being lazy. What we were doing is we were doing our ceremonies because we saw that as an important aspect of developing our spirituality. And by developing our spirituality, we developed our spiritual maturity and our values and that type of thing. These are the things that are missing today, right? We're in a post-truth era. We're in a post-respect era, I think, and a lot of things, And so, people talk about going back to basics. I would say that, we need to tell young children that there is a spirit world. We need to tell them that there is a creator. We need to tell them that we weren't here just to make money or just to gain wealth and that type of thing. I think we need to, so when you looked at our child raising, what we did is we would talk to children about these things from a very early age. We talk about our ancestors. We talk about respecting the animals and plants. And, simple things like, for example, songs and dances. We were big in songs and dances, like a lot of Indigenous cultures are, they're very big on, for example, what you might call art, making their own clothing, having dances and songs. And guess what kids like? You think if kids were given a choice between learning mathematics and English versus a choice of going and singing and dancing and making things, which you think they would choose, right? Those are the things that really resonate with kids, right? And I think we need to somehow be able to raise kids that, are not going to think necessarily that, they should be thinking first about being themselves good people from a spiritual point of view, that people who have an understanding of why we're here as spiritual beings, how humans should be behaving as spiritual beings, and not just people who are going to a 9-to-5 job and destroying the environment.
There's a question about COVID times as well. With COVID being such a huge roadblock, trying to keep students safe, but then wanting again to keep ceremony part of their lives, what would you suggest doing today to keep these sacred ceremonies alive and allow young Indigenous students to be connected?
Well, we have to adapt out of necessity. I've heard of people doing ceremonies online, for example, right? Which is not... ceremonies, some people say ceremonies, you get different views, right? Some people say the ceremonies have to be done absolutely a certain way, whether or not good. Other people say you have to adapt and, you adapt to the circumstances and you do ceremonies, as long as you've got the right idea of what a ceremony is about and as long as you've got the, ceremonies are held for certain purposes, right? And so if people are clear on those purposes and they can follow the protocols as best they can, well, that's the next best thing that you can do in a pandemic. But certainly, there's no replacement for the real thing, right? In terms of, being there in person, being with elders and that type of thing. That's the way the Creator intended it to be. But it's not to say that, it's not possible to innovate.
Dr. Stonechild, our time is up here. Thank you so much for being such an inspiration to us all who are here tonight. And thank you for pushing us to think at a deeper level. This concludes our session today. Thank you everyone so much for coming and spending this time together with Dr. Stonechild. I have to say that the recording of this event will be made available on our Faculty of Education YouTube channel, and the link will be sent to all of the registered participants. Thank you so much. Good evening and stay safe.